All right, let's dive in. Today we're hitting the streets, well, the sidewalks, specifically in Greenwich Village in New York City.
Oh, cool.
And our guide is Mitchell Duneier's Sidewalk.
Okay.
Have you had a chance to check it out?
I have. Yeah, it's a fascinating look at.
It's a deep dive into the lives of street vendors, right?
Yeah.
And, it's more than just buying and selling.
Right.
It's about this whole social world that they create with its own norms and structures and challenges, everyday challenges they face.
Yeah, you know what I think is so interesting about this book is that Duneier doesn't just observe,
Right.
He actually embeds himself in this world.
Oh, wow.
Like he sells magazines alongside the people that he's studying.
Wow.
And so you get this incredible insight into the community most of us just kind of walk by and don't really think about.
Yeah, and one of the things that really struck me was this idea of a public character.
Uh-huh.
And Duneier highlights Hakeem, a black book vendor, and he becomes this central figure on 6th Avenue. But what I found interesting was that Hakeem is college educated.
Right.
This isn't just about, scraping by or whatever.
Yeah, it really challenges our assumptions about who these vendors are, right?
It does.
He's choosing this life.
Right.
He sees it as a meaningful way to connect with people, to be a part of his community.
Yeah.
And he becomes this really trusted figure, helping residents, doing little errands, watching over the street.
Wow.
He even offers advice to young people like Jerome, who's a part-time stock clerk.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting part of it, too.
Yeah.
That he would connect with these younger people and actually try to, guide them and mentor them in a way.
Yeah.
I was also struck by the way Hakeem used his knowledge of Black history and culture to engage with people.
Right.
It's so interesting to see how he would kind of bring that into his interactions on the sidewalk.
Exactly. It's like this unexpected space for intellectual exchange.
Yeah.
Right there on the street,
Right.
And it just shows how education and knowledge can have these ripple effects. Yeah.
That reach beyond
Yeah.
traditional classrooms.
Absolutely. And it makes you think, you could just have a chance encounter with this guy.
Right.
And it could, spark someone's interest in Black history.
Right.
And it could lead them down this whole other path.
Absolutely.
But the book doesn't shy away from the tougher realities,
Yeah, right.
We meet Marvin, he's a veteran magazine vendor, and he takes Ron, a younger guy, battling addiction, under his wing.
Yeah.
And it's this really complex relationship.
It is. Marvin is trying to embody this old head wisdom,
Yeah.
trying to offer guidance and support.
Right.
But Ron's struggles are just a constant challenge.
They are.
And it really highlights the limits of this informal social control that exists on the sidewalk. You have this community trying to uphold these certain standards, but they're dealing with poverty, they're dealing with addiction, they're dealing with the lack of resources.
Yeah, you can really feel Marvin's love for Ron.
Oh,
Because, like he's a younger brother he never had.
and he just wants to steer him, right?
Yeah.
And there are these moments of hope, when Ron talks about his kids and wanting to be better for them.
Mm-hmm.
But then he goes back on this mission to get high.
Yeah.
And you can see the toll it takes on Marvin.
Yeah, and it raises the question, how do you maintain order,
Right.
and a sense of community when you have this system that's constantly pushing people to the margins?
Right, exactly.
The sidewalk becomes like this little microcosm of society's struggles.
It does.
And you see that even in something as basic as needing to use the restroom,
Oh, yeah.
it becomes this huge challenge.
That's something Duneier really brought to light,
He does,
that there's this lack of public restrooms for these guys.
right?
So what happens when you got to go,
Right, and he documents these really resourceful and sometimes kind of uncomfortable strategies
Yeah.
that they come up with. Like Mudrik, he pretends to hail a cab
Oh, gee.
while he's urinating into a cup. It's just this stark reminder of how invisible these basic needs can be
Right.
when you don't have access to private spaces.
And then there's the way that Mudrik interacts with women.
Yeah.
But maybe cringe a little bit reading it,
Yeah.
There's this loneliness, this bravado, and just a complete disregard for social cues.
Right.
It was really uncomfortable, especially when you compare it to the respectful approach of guys like Hakeem and Marvin.
Yeah, and Duneier isn't trying to present some romanticized view of this community.
Right.
He's showing us the whole spectrum, good and bad.
Yeah.
But these interactions, especially with Mudrik, they raise these uncomfortable questions about power dynamics.
Yeah.
How much does someone's social standing or lack thereof influence how they're perceived and treated, even in these casual encounters?
Yeah, and it makes you think about those unspoken rules of public space,
Yeah.
who gets to feel comfortable and who's constantly being judged
Right.
or scrutinized.
And then you have this accusation that's often thrown at street vendors.
Oh,
Caveat vendor,
oh
like the
yeah.
idea that they're selling stolen goods.
Right.
And it goes beyond just a few bad apples.
Right.
It's this deep suspicion of the entire informal economy.
It is.
Like it's morally suspect.
Right, and it creates this kind of moral gray area, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But what I found interesting was the hypocrisy that Duneier uncovers.
Yeah.
We see a police officer accusing Hakim of selling stolen books.
Based on nothing.
Yeah, like just this gut feeling.
Gut feeling.
But then Duneier goes and he uncovers these documented cases of stolen books ending up in mainstream bookstores like the Strand.
Oh, wow.
So it's like, where's the accountability there, right?
Right. That double standard is so revealing, isn't it?
It is.
It shows how our perceptions of legitimacy are tied to social class and appearance.
Appearances. A well-known bookstore gets the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
But a black vendor on the street is automatically suspected. Yeah, and it's just this frustrating reality for these guys.
Right.
They're trying to carve out a living, they're trying to operate within their own code of ethics, but they're constantly facing this judgment and this scrutiny.
Right.
And then things get even tougher with the introduction of Local Law 45.
Right.
So can you explain what the intended purpose of this law was?
Yeah, so the law was supposed to regulate vending spaces.
Okay.
So the idea was to bring some order to the sidewalk.
Yeah.
But what it actually did was restrict the amount of legal vending space.
Oh, wow.
And that led to more competition and conflict.
Oh, wow.
Especially between the unhoused vendors and the vendors that actually had a place to go at night.
Right.
Because they were competing for the same limited space.
So these space wars that Duneier talks about,
Yes.
They get pretty intense.
They do. We see this really dramatic confrontation between Hakim and Muhammad
Yes.
over a prime vending spot.
Yeah, it's such a powerful scene.
It is.
Because it really shows the desperation
Yeah.
and the sense of injustice that these guys feel.
Yeah. And for these vendors, it's not just about making a few bucks.
Yeah.
It's about claiming a space.
Right.
It's about having some dignity in a world that's constantly trying to push them aside.
Yeah, and it raises this crucial question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About, who gets to decide what constitutes order in public spaces
Right.
and how those decisions impact those who are already marginalized.
Yeah, exactly.
And those questions become even more, pointed when we contrast the experiences of the vendors on 6th Avenue
Yeah.
with the Romp family, the white Christmas tree sellers on Jane Street.
Right. Like stepping into a whole different world.
They are.
Yeah.
I mean, they're welcomed with open arms,
Yeah.
offered help,
Yeah.
giving keys to an apartment.
Yeah.
It's just so different from the suspicion and the distrust
Yeah.
that those black vendors are facing just a few blocks away.
Right. And what do you make of that contrast?
It's just a powerful illustration, isn't it?
It is.
Of how race and class shape perceptions
Yeah.
and how people are treated.
Absolutely. The Romps, they're a white family.
Right.
They're engaged in this, seasonal, wholesome trade.
Right.
They benefit from this presumption of decency
Yeah.
and safety that's just not extended to the black vendors on 6th Avenue.
It's not even extended to Alice, the Filipina vendor who cares for her black grandchildren.
Right, exactly.
She faces that same kind of judgment and suspicion.
Even though she's got those clear family ties
Yeah.
and she's, trying to keep her grandchildren clean and cared for, it's like these unspoken rules of respectability
Yeah.
are applied differently based on race and social standing.
And it just makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what if a black family had set up a Christmas tree stand on Jane Street?
Right.
Would they have been met with that same generosity?
Right.
And trust.
That's a question Duneier doesn't explicitly answer.
Right.
But he gives us enough evidence to really question our own assumptions about how these power dynamics work.
He does.
It challenges us to think about how much our own perceptions,
Right.
shaped by these societal biases, influence the way we interact with people who are different from us. And, what can we do to challenge those biases
Right.
to create a more just and equitable public space for everyone?
So we've seen these contrasting realities play out on the sidewalks, but there's another layer to this story.
Okay.
And that's the role of the researcher.
Yeah.
Because Duneier himself faces ethical dilemmas,
Right.
questioning his own power and influence within this community.
Yeah.
And we're going to explore that further in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But for now, let's just take a moment and reflect on what we've learned so far.
Yeah.
We've seen ingenuity,
Yeah.
resilience,
Yeah.
and just stark inequalities.
Absolutely. So we left off thinking about, how our own perceptions impact how we see people living and working on the margins. Duneier really pushes us to go deeper and think about that, right?
Yeah. And, it's easy to focus on the struggles.
Right.
But what really stood out to me was just how resourceful and resilient these men are.
Yeah.
Like Hakeem using his knowledge
Hmm.
to connect with people,
Right.
to create something more than just selling books,
Absolutely.
It kind of challenges the stereotype of a street vendor just trying to get by, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we often overlook the skills and knowledge that it takes to operate in the informal economy.
Yeah.
Think about all the things they're doing every day.
Yeah.
Scavenging and sorting merchandise, negotiating prices,
Right.
building relationships with customers.
Right.
It's a different kind of intelligence.
Yeah, it is. And they're constantly adapting,
Right.
whether it's competition for space or new laws or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They're problem solvers.
Yeah.
Entrepreneurs, really.
Really?
Take Marvin, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, not only does he manage his own magazine vending,
Right.
but he's also mentoring Ron,
He is.
guiding him through his addiction.
He's embodying that old head wisdom,
Yeah.
passing on values,
Yeah.
creating that sense of community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And their relationship is so complex, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, you see that deep care that Marvin has for Ron,
Yeah.
but also that frustration and heartbreak when Ron slips back into his addiction.
Yeah, and it kind of highlights the limits of that informal social control, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You have this desire to support each other,
Right.
to keep things in order,
Right.
but it's constantly bumping up against the reality of their circumstances.
And it makes you question all those simple narratives
Yeah.
about crime and disorder.
Right.
Like that broken windows theory.
Yeah.
Duneier shows that order and disorder aren't always so black and white,
Right. There's this whole social fabric going on
Yeah.
with its own codes of conduct,
Yeah.
mechanisms for maintaining community.
And while we shouldn't romanticize the challenges they face,
Right.
I think it's so important to recognize their agency and the ways they create meaning within those constraints.
Absolutely. They're not just passive victims. They're
Yeah.
actively shaping their own lives
Yeah.
and the world around them.
Which brings us to Duneier's own position in all of this.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he's not just observing,
Right.
he's participating.
He is. He becomes a vendor himself,
Yeah.
experiences those same struggles and triumphs.
Do you think that approach, while providing amazing insight,
Yeah.
also creates its own set of dilemmas?
It's something that Duneier really grapples with throughout the book.
Yeah.
He acknowledges his own privilege
Right.
as a white middle-class academic,
Right.
and he knows that just by being there,
Yeah.
he's changing the dynamic.
Yeah.
He's constantly reflecting on his role.
Yeah.
Questioning whether he's truly representing the community's voices
Right.
or if he's imposing his own interpretation.
And some critics say he's romanticizing the sidewalk,
Yeah.
glossing over the darker sides of poverty and addiction and violence.
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
But I think Duneier is careful to balance those darker aspects with stories of resilience
Right.
and hope. He doesn't shy away from those harsh realities. But he's also pushing us to see beyond those stereotypes.
Right.
To recognize the full spectrum of human experience that's happening there.
And that complexity is what makes the book so interesting, isn't it?
It is. It's not just an academic study.
Right.
It's a window into the lives of real people.
It is.
With their own stories, their own struggles, their own triumphs.
And it forces us to confront our own assumptions about poverty and homelessness.
Right. And it raises those uncomfortable questions about our own complicity.
Yeah.
Like, are we doing enough to address the inequalities that create these circumstances?
Right.
Are we offering support and resources that actually meet people's needs?
It's a call to action, isn't it?
It is.
To look beyond those surface level judgments.
Yeah.
To really engage with the complexity of urban life.
And to recognize that knowledge is most valuable
Yeah.
when it's applied.
Right.
What can we learn from this?
Yeah.
How can we use these insights to inform our own actions, our own decisions?
Yeah.
How can we be more compassionate and understanding
Yeah.
when we interact with people who are different from us?
Those are powerful questions.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up this part,
Okay.
I want to revisit those contrasting experiences on Jane Street.
Okay.
The Rom family and Alice with her grandchildren.
Yeah.
It's a comparison that really stuck with me.
That contrast really lays bare those implicit biases
It does.
that shape how we see people,
Right.
how we interact with them.
Yeah. The Rom family, white family, selling Christmas trees.
Yeah.
They're immediately embraced by the community.
They are offered help, support, even keys to an apartment.
But Alice, a Filipino vendor caring for her Black grandchildren,
Right.
is met with suspicion and judgment.
Even though she's got clear family ties. And she's trying so hard to provide that loving environment.
It's like this social experiment playing out
Right.
in real time.
Yeah, and it shows how those unspoken rules of respectability are often tied to race and class. Like, who gets the benefit of the doubt?
Yeah.
Whose struggles are worthy of sympathy,
Yeah.
of support?
And it makes you realize that even the simplest interactions have all these complex layers of societal conditioning.
Absolutely.
And it pushes us to be more mindful of our own biases,
Right.
to question those assumptions that might make us treat people differently based on their race or their class.
And to recognize that these biases aren't just personal failings.
Right.
They're rooted in these systemic inequalities that we've had for generations.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important aspect of Duneier's work.
Okay.
The role of public policy
Right.
in shaping the lives of people on the margins.
Right.
We've seen how laws like Local Law 45, intended to create order, can actually have these unintended consequences.
Right. Further marginalizing people.
Right. It really emphasizes the need for more nuanced and compassionate approaches to policy.
Yeah.
You know, approaches that actually address the root causes of poverty and homelessness.
Yeah.
Instead of just criminalizing people.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that we all have a role to play in
Right.
advocating for more just and equitable policies.
Yeah.
Policies that create opportunities for everyone to thrive.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive,
Okay.
let's keep these questions in mind.
Okay.
How can we challenge these harmful narratives about poverty and homelessness?
Right.
How can we advocate for more effective and humane policies?
Yeah.
And most importantly, how can we create a society where everyone has the chance to live with dignity and respect? Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Sidewalk.
Okay.
And, you know, we talked about the complexities of life on the margins, the resilience, the inequalities, the ethical dilemmas.
Right.
But one theme that keeps popping up is race.
Yeah, absolutely connects so many of the experiences in the book, you know?
Yeah, and Duneier doesn't shy away from that, does he?
Not at all. Like that comparison between the Romp family on Jane Street
Right.
and the Black vendors on 6th Avenue.
Right.
It's such a stark example of how race shapes people's perceptions
It really is.
and their interactions with each other.
Such a vivid contrast, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Romps, a white family selling Christmas trees.
Right.
They're welcomed.
Yeah, open arms.
People offer them help, food, a place to stay.
It's amazing.
But a few blocks away, you have Black vendors
Right.
facing suspicion, distrust, accusations.
And it's not just those specific instances.
Right.
Remember Alice, the Filipino vendor,
Yes.
taking care of her Black grandchildren?
Yeah, she faces judgment too.
Even though she's got those family ties and she's working so hard to keep her grandkids clean and well cared for.
It's like there's this invisible barrier.
Yeah.
This wall built on race and class.
Yeah, it determines who we see as trustworthy or deserving.
Right, or even safe.
Exactly. And those assumptions are deeply ingrained in our society, you
Yeah.
know, reinforced by the media, by history, by our institutions.
It's not just about individual prejudice, is it?
No, it's about systemic racism that affects everything.
Yeah, makes you realize how much work we have to do to dismantle these systems.
It's a huge undertaking.
How do we challenge those biases?
Right.
How do we create a world where everyone's treated with dignity and respect?
It questions.
Yeah, regardless of their race or social standing.
It's a complex issue.
It is. No easy answers.
But Duneier gives us a starting point, right?
Yeah, he makes us confront those uncomfortable truths.
He does.
Acknowledge how race shapes our views and affects how we treat each other.
He challenges us to see beyond the judgments,
Yeah.
to see the individuals.
Right, see their humanity.
And he reminds us it's not just about individual responsibility. It's about dismantling the systems, the policies that keep this inequality going.
Like Local Law 45, which was supposed to regulate vending.
But it ended up hurting marginalized communities the most.
Shows that good intentions aren't enough, right?
No.
We have to think about the consequences.
Absolutely.
Advocate for policies that are actually fair.
And that's where we come in, right?
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and listen. We have to use this knowledge to take action.
Exactly. Challenge those harmful narratives about poverty and race.
Support organizations fighting for justice.
Well,
Our leaders accountable.
it's about more than just feeling bad.
Yeah.
It's about doing something
Using our privilege to help others.
and recognizing that this is a long process.
Right.
It's a journey, you know?
Yeah. It's not going to happen overnight.
Right. We need to keep at it, keep learning, keep fighting for a better world.
So as we leave the sidewalks of Greenwich Village, let's take these lessons with us.
Let's challenge those assumptions.
Let's be more compassionate, more understanding.
More willing to fight for what's right.
Duneier gave us a glimpse into this world full of challenges, but also resilience and hope.
It really is.
If you're interested in learning more,
Yeah.
check out the book Sidewalk.
Yeah. It's worth a read.
And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.